Okay, and welcome back. This is Module 3. This is Microsoft Virtual Academy for the XAML developer. We're talking about Blend and the tooling that XAML developers have. This session is all Blend all the time. There's a lot for us to talk about. I think before we even get into the tool, Uni, let's take just a second and talk about what Blend is. I have Visual Studio. If I install Visual Studio... Now, I saw some people on the chat asking about which version of Visual Studio. This is Visual Studio 2013 we're talking about. And Professional Up has all that we're talking about with the exception of UI testing. UI testing is Ultimate only. But I install Visual Studio 2013. Blend comes right along for the ride.
Yeah, actually, it's with Express. Like if you're building, if you're downloading the Windows Desktop Express, like the one for Windows Store apps,
Yeah.
you get that too. Like
You always get Blend. It's
pretty
right
much
there.
it's always there.
Now, give me the idea. I'm a developer. I'm doing all of my coding. I love C#. I'm typing. Why would I go into Blend? What's the workflow that transitions me over there?
Blends, like we discussed in a module earlier, like if you're doing code-focused tasks, you probably are writing a lot of code, and you're sort of like just switching to XAML to make a quick edit. That's the Visual Studio workflow.
Yeah.
Blend's about like deep diving and finessing your UI and sort of working with assets from Photoshop and sort of styling your app and things like that. So the panels in Blend are primarily designed to let you do like code-focused, design-focused tasks.
To be clear, there's nothing I'm doing in Blend that I couldn't do in Visual Studio. It's Blend that's making those easier for me with all this special tooling around it.
Yeah.
For example, I might be doing some animations. And if I want to do animations in Visual Studio, I can start typing and I can get it done. But if I want to make that easier and I want to visually see that,
yeah, and it's like if you're doing the animation, if you're bringing up the animation panel, you need a lot more real estate, for example, to view your timeline, right? That sort of thing is hard to fit inside your code-focused, UX, and that's sort of the way I see Blend and Visual Studio. Like it's the same technology and things like that, but at the end of the day, the set of features required to do design-focused tasks is quite different than the set of features required to do code-focused tasks.
so it may not. It's not a 50-50 trade-off. It's probably a 75% of the time you're doing your UX design. You'll probably be in Blend tweaking it, getting the way you like. Probably 75% you're doing your logic and all the rest of your app. You're going to be in Visual Studio with an occasional trip back over to Blend.
Yeah, I mean the thing about the whole thing is it's using the same solution format. You
What
kind
about
of
source control? I mean, am I giving up anything?
Absolutely no. You're working with your solution under TFS source control just fine and things like that. You could potentially have a lot of developers have dual monitors, absolutely common. You could have Blend and Visual Studio on two different monitors, and you could switch back and forth there as well. Like you make a change in Blend and Visual Studio automatically detects it, and vice versa. That's an extremely common workflow as well. The solutions are perfectly round trippable. You make a change to the CSproj or the SLN in Blend or VS. You switch back to the other and just reload the project and solution and get up and running.
So we're going to talk specifically about Blend writing Windows 8 store apps, but Blend is available for phone developers so they can build their UI. Blend is available for
WPF developers.
of course, WPF developers, and always has been.
Silverlight, and then of course Windows Store apps.
In our Windows Store apps as well.
The only reason we're talking about Windows Store apps today is just because it sort of allows us to highlight some of the new controls and things like that. The features like IntelliSense and whatever you're going to show today are all applicable for all of these platforms equally.
Let me open up, I have an app here, so let me open up an app in Visual Studio, and I'll just open up the exact same page then in Blend. So just like you showed before, I'll go to my XAML page, right-click, and just say Open in Blend. It doesn't open up that file. It opens up the entire project like you would want, and then, of course, it's talking to me about solution folders. And so if I have to make a change and there's a resource that's in another file or wherever, it's just like when I'm in Visual Studio, I have access to the entire solution.
That's correct.
All right, so here's a simple enough little app here. And let's talk about the panels that we have. So let's just kind of walk through, give a quick tour of Blend. So similar to how we did in Visual Studio, here's the projects. This is equivalent to the Solution Explorer inside Visual Studio. I can go through and see all my files. And just like I can there, here I can add files as well. So if I need to add something, I don't have to jump back to Visual Studio to do that. I can do that here. I can, and then I can go into Assets. Now, Assets is a interesting name. What's the Assets panel do?
It's, I would say, a superset of the Visual Studio Toolbox functionality. It shows you all of the controls that you could potentially drag and drop on your page. But we also show you assets in terms of the fact that we show you styles and behaviors and things like that, images. So we show you more than just controls. So I would see that as a superset of the same functionality in Visual Studio.
I would say it's a super duper set.
Yeah.
All right, great. So that's the, I just grabbed this one by mistake. Let's go over to states. The states panel, only in Blend. What does the states panel do?
The states panel allows you to, and we probably have some deep dives there as well. The states panel allows you to create visual states for your app that you can trigger using code or behaviors that you're going to show about in a second as well. That allows you to customize the look and feel of your entire page, your control, or even sort of like existing Windows controls. If you want to change the look and feel of those controls, you'd use states. States are fancy property bag and animation system combined together that you can easily invoke or navigate to a particular state with a simple line of code.
That's
in
right.
some cases, writing no code at all.
In some cases, with using a behavior, I could do it with none. And states are probably another underutilized feature of XAML that really is one of its most powerful as well. The ability to really define your view in a specific perspective. You know, the game is over. It has the game over look to it. The game's playing. It has the pause button available.
Right.
And all
I mean, the interesting part with states is if you talked about states in the WPF and Silverlight timeframes, it was all about like dramatically changing the look and feel of your button and making it look all fancy. When you talk about Windows Store apps and the Metro design principle in general, you are sort of like talking about content over Chrome and things like that. So states have sort of morphed from being primarily about styling a control to sort of laying out your controls on a particular page and sort of responding to different form factor settings and things like that. I mean, there's use cases across the board, but that's where I see majority of the use cases these days.
It's such a powerful piece, and we'll talk about animations, but sometimes there are fewer animations in a XAML project because they're using states, which sort of infers the animation behind it.
Absolutely. Animations are, I would say, so 2000s at this point in time, because you have, first of all, pre-built animations that these platforms already give you. So if you wanted to do like, a fade in or a transition in, you would use a pre-canned animation because then you can sort of adhere to the standards of all of these apps running on Windows that all look
trust that it was done right,
where appropriate, right? You want to be different, but you also want to be consistent where appropriate. So that sort of lets you do that.
That is a tricky balance and a thin line
absolutely.
of differentiation, but still.
Absolutely. You want to innovate on your UX as much as you can, but at the same time, you don't want to over-innovate. You do want to sort of maintain the family appeal of all of these apps working together on Windows to a certain extent.
Since we're talking about Blend today, I think it's great that you and I both have dark shirts on, just that designer style going on. It's way too hot in here to have a turtleneck. So we have the device panel. We don't need to talk about that because we know what that is. Down here is objects and timeline. And the reason we know what that is, by the way, in case this is the only module that you're watching, we talked about it last module, module 2. And so the objects and timeline, now we're getting into storyboards and animation, not just raw storyboards and animation, which of course it could be, but also some details in the when you're messing with states.
Absolutely. I mean, the left-hand side, if you don't mind clicking the plus button on there.
Well, here we go.
Yeah, the new button. Yep, that's good. Just hit OK. We'll talk about the storyboards things in a second.
Beautiful.
I mean, the left-hand side of this panel looks very similar to what we saw in Visual Studio. It's sort of your object representation or hierarchical representation of your XAML, and you're sort of seeing your content.
It's document outline.
Exactly, yeah. The right-hand side of this panel is the animation system, where you would do keyframes and things like that. We'll talk about animations later in the module.
And here I can visualize a timeline.
Exactly.
I see, very nice. And then, of course, we're just doing a run.
You probably want to close it at this point.
I have oh yeah, so it doesn't record. There we are. And I have the properties panel, which is just the properties panel, almost identical to Visual Studio, if not identical to Visual Studio. I have resources, which is new.
Yes, absolutely. That's the place you would go to manage your resources, right? Resources are pretty critical, where you want to share consistency of look and feel across multiple pages in your app. Resources can be anywhere, anything from styles and fonts and brushes to more complex objects like data models and things like that. That's the place you would go to manage your resources, like rename, refactor, move things around, and so on and so forth.
And it's great because it allows you to visualize the scope of those as well. If they're in scope for another page but not yours, you can
we
see
show
why
you
they're not
everything
available.
that's available in scope,
Yeah.
And when you drag and drop it, we do the right thing of like hooking up the right reference to the dictionary or whatever it is to get your functional app.
Again, it's all the stuff you could do manually by typing, but the odds of getting it wrong are almost zero when you do it here.
Yep.
And then we have the Data tab, and we'll come back to this in a little more detail, but at a high level, the Data tab allows you to really work with the data binding structures or a data binding capability in your XAML app almost in a visual way.
Absolutely.
And we'll come back and do that at a really deep dive, and so we won't do it right now. Now, I think it's worth at least just tracing down some of these options over here on the left so that we can see what those are. So the first one is this dark arrow. That's just a basic selection, and that's the one that's the default and most people use all the time.
Yeah,
but
Jerry, I don't see the toolbox. I don't know if it's hidden
here.
or
I'll
not.
just pull it over to make sure
it's just the screen.
Yeah, so there we are. The first one, it's the selection arrow. And then we have this white arrow. It's the direct selection. It's a little bit different.
Yes. The selection arrow, sort of think about it as like it's top down versus bottoms up. Like if you do the white arrow, so to speak, or the sub-selection, you select the innermost element first. And the direct selection tool, you select the outermost element first. Depends upon the way you see it. And the second thing about the sub-selection tool is if you're doing path editing, if you're editing a path, you want to sort of disambiguate between selecting the path itself versus selecting points on the path. Operations like that require two tools, very common in a variety of design tools. And the same tools exist in Blend.
So if I have a square or a rectangle, if I use the typical one, right? I'll select the entire rectangle. It's this direct selection allows me to grab a corner.
Yes.
Yeah.
If it's a path.
If it's a path, right.
Correct.
Yeah. Rectangle is actually a bad example because it doesn't have you can't grab the corner. But if it's a path, right. The little hand is pretty nifty, right?
That's the thing that we saw in Visual Studio. Yeah. When you press the space bar, it's the same as using that tool over there. Yeah. It's just more discoverable. Like if you are doing fast visual design, you would never use that tool. You would just use the space bar.
Yeah.
That's a more permanent way to go into a mode where you can pan your artboard and view different parts of your design surface.
This one is to zoom, but I prefer just kind of rolling my mouse. But if I don't happen to have a roller,
that allows you to precisely zoom into a particular part. Let's say you want to zoom into that texture on the bottom right, the lime green thing.
Okay.
You select that range over there. And then you can sort of zoom into that particular area.
Yeah.
So this is a combination of you using the zoom options on the design surface as well as the pan tool.
Yeah, and this just does it for me in that zone.
You can focus on an area quickly using that particular tool.
Right. And if I wanted to zoom out, just roll my mouse and it'll come back out.
Yep.
Everything's fine. Or just like before, I have this little drag right here.
Yeah, and there are some shortcuts as well. You can double click on one of these tools, like I think the zoom tool and the pan tool, to sort of do different things. Like just double click on the pan tool.
Double click on
the hand tool.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
So that's the shortcut to center your artboard quickly.
I see. So if I was inside here one right now, double click, I'm back at home, center point.
And then double click on the zoom tool, that's just doing different things.
And this brings me out.
Exactly. There are different tools have different sort of like connotations in terms of what they do.
So I'm at 100% right now. I need to be a little bit smaller for this screen. Let's say, there we go, perfect. All right, so, I forget I can't see these. There's the eyedropper. This is nifty. Why would I use the eyedropper by itself and not in the context of designing?
We find a lot of people don't use the eyedropper and paint bucket tools. They're sort of like legacy from some of our other design tools.
Yeah.
I think the more interesting tool is the eyedropper that's a part of the brush editor, where you want to copy a color from somewhere on the internet, let's say. In
fact, let me show what you're talking about there because it's pretty cool. If I'm in let's say I'm in my grid and I'm looking at the background here and I want to change this. Here's the dropper.
And let's say you want the Visual Studio blue thing on the background that you see there.
I can go outside of my app. I don't have to be inside. I have a web page up right now. I could get a dropper off of that image anywhere that I want it to be. Nice. And hit escape to get out of it as well. This is pretty handy if I'm wanting to draw something. I wanted to create a path on the fly. For some reason, I need to circle something or highlight it, and I have a visual state that reveals that.
Yep, and I should mention that our path tools are great for making incremental edits, not for creating like vector graphics from scratch. You would want to use other more powerful tools for doing that. And then we have the ability to import Illustrator and Photoshop content. Wow. So that's a more common way. So the more common workflow could be, hey, use Illustrator to draw your vector graphics or expression design for that matter, then import the content into your page, and then make minor tweaks using these tools.
Got it. So that's a good takeaway. There are some vector editing techniques or tooling inside Blend. We're not saying this is Illustrator or Design or any of those tools. We're just helping out.
Yep.
Then we can start building some of the basic geometries here, so lines and rectangles. These are layout controls that we can use and drag those in.
Just the common ones, right? You can go to the asset library for the
if something's missing,
gamut
like hub, if something like hub is missing, I can always go up to assets and just find it right here, and hub will show up right there. Right? I can always get all of them from there. These are just the common ones for me. All right, great. We did skip these drawing tools. These are the ones that if you do happen to have a path, you can fill it and do some other things as well, or add a little gradient. Okay. Now I can make it full screen, yes. But I couldn't before because that little edge wasn't showing up for one reason or another, at least on this monitor.
That's not complete. They can see it.
Oh, okay, everybody could see it but us. Oh, great. All right, so one of the features inside, but I think we covered it. Did we miss anything important?
Nope, I think we're good.
Yeah, I think so too. In fact, let me pull up options. Just because we're in Blend, this might be the first time they've seen Blend. Let me go through. So sometimes it scares people that it's in the dark theme to start with for one reason or another. So you can swap it over to the light theme if you need to. But you can also go down and you can change a lot of different pieces. Not all that many to confuse you or whatever. But I like going into the artboard and changing the way that the mouse wheel works whenever it zooms. I like control mouse wheel when I do it. That syncs it up to the behavior that it has inside Visual Studio. Then I don't have to think, and the less I think about things like that, the better. And as well as other things that you can change as well. Any of these you want to call out right now yourself?
No, I think pretty much our goal is to make sure that you never have to go to the options dialog. So not an area that I'm really proud about,
Right. Okay, perfect. So we'll get out of that, and let me jump over and make sure that we talk about the agenda here. Let me back up. Here we are. So now around pixel perfect design. So this is the idea of using Blend to create your UI and create a perfect UI. It's a funny way to think about it. If I were inside here and I wanted to add a rectangle, Blend helps me just right out of the box, just moving it around. As I move it, it moves, and I have this ruler up here where I might want to have things attached to. Maybe I'll
you can see in the ruler area, you can see like the size of the rectangle
from here to here.
Yeah, that's your height. And the left-hand side will show you the width as well on the left-hand side ruler.
So here, let me make it more of a rectangle so you can see more dramatic.
Yeah.
So here I can see where it's, that is awesome.
Relative to the left of the page, you are at 200 pixels. Relative to the right of the page, you are at 764 pixels or whatever that is, and so on and so forth. So because design specifications are often made relative to an anchor point, not necessarily relative to like the left.
So if I knew it had to be 200 pixels from the left, 40 pixels from the top, I could nail it right here.
Yeah.
That's right. And I can use my keyboard if I need to really just move one little dot and I feel my mouse is too fast. But sometimes I need to be more specific than that, or I need to have a little bit more guidance than that. And so that's where not just the ruler, but we also have guides as well. And I want to add a guide to make sure that I put this rectangle in the right spot, like right at the top of this watch, let's just say. To add a guide to my canvas, what do I do?
I mean, the watch thing actually is a great example, because what you're seeing there is that XAML watch text over there is content that's coming from the hub control.
Yes.
You just specified a property, and the hub control takes care of it. So there is no visual in your project that you can use to align to. That's the beauty of the guide, right? The guide allows you to create a visual artifact that you can use to baseline align things to. Yeah. So let's go ahead and create a guide.
Which is not insert guide or right click, or I just go up to the ruler.
That's correct. And let's do a vertical one.
Right,
and
right
let's
go over to this ruler and pretend like there's one there. Just pretend like I'm grabbing it and pulling it out.
Yep. And then you just position that on the left-hand side of the XAML. And zoom in a little bit to get it just about right.
All right, I'm going to make this absolutely flawless.
So you can see like this is a visual artifact that you just created, which doesn't impact your running app at all. This is a pure design time construct. You just went ahead and created a guide that allowed you to sort of get your layout just about right. Now, if you're...
This is basically saying 40 pixels from the left.
That's correct. And that you can see like that's the standard Windows specification kicking in, where the header is 40 pixels from the left and things like that, right? Now, the hub control does that for you, but your goal is to sort of make sure that in non-standard cases, you don't know that value, and the guide system allows you to sort of like get that just about right. Okay. So let's go ahead and like now use the rectangle and position that relative to the...
Now I'm going to get really close, but I see it's turning red as I get really close to it. I'll zoom in. All right, so first I have this kind of a grayed out red zone. That's giving me a fixed 50 pixel warning.
Yeah, no, that is like really like, you can change that as well. Like in the options dialog, you have the option of changing, that's like margin relative to a particular point. So in this case, you have about 8 pixels relative to the guide.
Okay, 8 pixels. I got it. All right,
Yeah, and
so
you can configure that value based on your, like most people actually these days use 20 by 20 or 10 by 10 or whatever that is to sort of specify their margins, or 4 by 4, however fine you want to get.
That's in the options dialog?
Yes.
Let me jump to it real quick just to make sure I am right there with you.
So I think it's an artboard, and then you can say like snap to, yeah, there we go.
Grid line spacing 5.
Yeah, the grid line spacing, I think in this case you want the default.
Default
right?
margin
Exactly.
5. I see, default margin 10. Got it. Beautiful. All right. So this is giving me at least, now everything can be spaced nicely, so I can have all my squares or whatever really nice, or I could go right up to it, and then, it's hard for me to demonstrate this, but it's snapping right to it for me. Right? So I don't have to work really hard to get it right.
And now it's 40 pixels from the left, as you can see.
And now the rectangle is perfectly 42 pixels as well. Now this is a little bit different if I had, say, a button. So here's my button, and a button is, here's my button right here. I'm going to also snap it, and I'm going to zoom in so we can see what we're doing here. And as I snap, it snaps in a funny way. It snaps to this outer line, but if I want to, it also snaps to this inner line. What's going on there?
So what's happening there is the button control, like we said, accessibility is super important. And one of the things about accessibility is keyboard accessibility. As you're doing tabbing through your UI, you want to show the focus that a particular control has. That area there between like the light blue line and the white line is where you would paint your dotted rectangle to at runtime to sort of say, hey, you know what, my focus is on this control. Now when you're doing design, like you really want to sort of make sure that the alignment does not sort of take that into consideration, because your default, if you were to sort of do focus visual based alignment, your UI is going to look slightly off. So in this case, what's going to happen is you're aligning to what's visible to the user when the user launches the app, and then the focus visual rectangle just happens to paint over on an outside area.
Well, I think this is a good takeaway. I could come up to this button and I could say left margin is 40, and it wouldn't actually be correct.
That's correct.
Yeah, this is actually fixing with that kind of transient visual that a button has.
That's correct. In this case, you essentially need a -3 on top, because that's the distance, or -4, whatever it is. That's the distance between the actual layout bounds of the button, as well as what's rendered inside the button that the user can see in most cases.
Yeah. So I'm your developer. I align it 20 pixels from the right. I give it to you. You're very design-minded. You could say, Jerry, this is just not right.
Yeah,
right? I'm like, what are you talking about? I did exactly 40 pixels like you said. Now, I can have another, if I want to, I could have it so that this lines up, let's say, with the other hub. But I could also do these horizontal and start dragging these down. And there's no practical limit to these, right? I could have as many as I need to in order to define my application. Now, I've gone to a lot of work here designing all these layouts. I've got everything the way I know that it needs to be. You and I are on the same team. I'd like to share this with you somehow. Is there anything I have to do immediately? We're using source control. You're going to check this out just like I am. Will you see these?
Yeah, absolutely. Just hit save.
All right.
And then go to the project panel. You can see Blend's already checking out.
Yeah, I can see it's doing some work back
So go to the projects panel.
All right.
And expand the design folder for this project. I think this is the watch.
This is the watch.
Yep.
Let me go get it real quick. I'll just hide the other so we don't have to think about them. There we go. Here's the watch.
So open the
there's a new folder that wasn't there before. Design.
I should reiterate that there is absolutely no impact to your app, either in the XAML or runtime when you do this thing. It's a pure design time construct. You're not increasing the size of your app or anything like that by doing these things. You're just helping the design workflow by sort of creating these guides.
So when I build this isn't like compiled up into it or anything like that?
Absolutely not. So now this is a part of source control. If someone else was to download it on a different machine, you do get your guides.
Now, I like having all these guides to get it just right. I'd kind of like to not delete them, but I don't want to look at them all the time.
So you can go to the View menu, and you can sort of choose to sort of show guides if you want.
Oh, I see.
And
so they're not deleted, they're just not
They're just
showing.
hidden, yeah. They're still part of the project. You can toggle them back on. There's a shortcut or whatever it is.
And there's another menu right here.
Yeah. So that's for, let's say you had multiple pages on your app.
Okay.
And you wanted to sort of like, and there's consistency across these pages, and you have a standard set of guides. You could sort of subdivide and conquer where you create different guide sections and import them into the app. So in this case, let's export your guides by saving them.
All right.
So let's go ahead and save them.
Let's put them on my desktop here.
Yeah, desktop right there. So hit OK. And then go back to a different project.
Well, let me, different project.
Yeah,
Sure, why
you
not?
could open a XAML file in a different project.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go to our math project.
Yep. Now it's not going to look right because the UI is not the same.
That's right.
But it sort of shows the idea. Now, note here that there's no design folder yet, right? So there's no guides. It's all clean.
No design folder.
So let's go ahead and import your guides that you just
So
exported.
I'll say
View,
manage guides, load guides.
That's correct.
It's on my desktop right
That's
here.
correct.
And I'll say, here are my guides right there.
Yep. So you essentially, now you have hidden the guides, so please go ahead and show them.
View, show guides.
Show guides, there we go. So now that you have sort of imported them, hit save,
Sure.
and the design folder just gets created for this
Oh, and there
particular
it is.
project as well. So it's a
So
project
now I've brought it
specific
in,
setting.
and now I've made it part of this
Yeah.
project.
And
which
you
is
can
what I was
share across projects, across the same XAML file, across different files in the same project. So guides are really useful in terms of like allowing you to create artifacts that you can visually use to align content across layout. In XAML layout, you have deep layout hierarchies and things like that. It's really hard to get layout right in terms of alignment when you have a control that's nested 10 levels deep in a panel with another control that's nested 10 levels deep in another panel. So guides actually really help get cross layout right, cross container layout just about right.
So this guide right here, this vertical one.
That's right.
I'm going to move it right here, and what it's going to, this one implies 40 pixels from the left. This one implies 40 pixels from the right.
Right now it says 1292 pixels from
That's
the
right.
left, but you could drop the menu to sort of say, hey, I want a right align guide. Now, one of the things about Windows Store apps and Blend in general is you're in a world where you're no longer designing for static layouts. You're designing for dynamic layouts. Your app's going to change, right?
Yeah.
You're going to make your app work on so many different form factors.
That's right. And this windowing thing kicks in. There's so many reasons your app will change in shape.
That's right. So the anchoring feature allows designers and developers to get their layout right relative to different points, be that left, right, top, or bottom. Because that's the way most specifications are done. People say, hey, you know what? I want things 20 pixels from the bottom. They won't say, I want things like 100 pixels from the top.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you resize, that specification goes invalid.
In fact, if I were to use devices right now and change it so that it's, let's say, so I'm in a 10-inch device, but now I'm going to go to a 10-inch device with 1920.
You can see like the thing resized. Of course, the DPI setting, pick the same DPI setting, 100 DPI, like that one right there.
This one right here.
Yes. You can see like the app now becomes bigger, but the guide still remains 20 pixels relative to the left, to the right, to the top, of the bottom.
Right. And so I'm looking at this, and I wonder which way it's anchored. There's a nice little flag at the top that points the direction that it's anchored
That's
as well.
correct.
Nice. That's a great way to get pixel perfect, no doubt about it. All right. So now I decide that I don't want these in my project anymore. I can just delete that from that folder. No big deal, right?
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that because it makes my project look like it's not. It's all wrong when it's not. All right, there, I'll delete the whole folder. Are you sure? I sure am sure. And
And you can
now,
just close and reopen that, and that'll be good to go. But anyways,
perfect. All right, let's talk about some other features inside Visual Studio. Inside Blend here. In the Assets folder, one of the things we kind of covered quickly was this Behaviors tab. And let me jump to slides so we can kind of talk about this, because this is really something unique to Blend and very, very powerful to allow you to reuse code and have reliable reuse patterns as well. So we're a couple here, right there. All right. So a behavior, if I were to say, Uni, what is a behavior? You would say, well, Jerry, a behavior is
a way to add interactivity to your app without writing code.
Yeah. I mean, and not to belabor it too much, but there is real code. It's just wrapped up and it's available in the designer.
It's prepackaged. Think about it as prepackaged code snippets that you can add visually without actually writing any code.
And so when we talk about behaviors, we're really talking about two things. We're talking about both behaviors and actions, and they always go together. The behavior is that thing that listens for something to occur. And so here you can see on the right, we have three that come right out of the box. We have this data trigger that's listening for something that implements iNotify property change, and whenever that property changes a value to anything, then the behavior will fire. It won't do anything because that is where the action occurs. Another one we have is event trigger, which is probably the most common. A button is clicked, the user does something, and then that behavior fires, and then it invokes some sort of action. And then we have this incremental update behavior, which is really the oddball of the group. It doesn't really have anything to do with an action. It's just a perfect implementation of handling the slow phasing in of UI elements on fast scrolling grids.
That's correct. Like that shows the ultimate power of the system, where you have probably I don't know, like 200 lines of code that's packaged in a nicely reusable way that you just drag and drop, and you get performant fast spanning without writing a single line of code.
Yeah.
Where you would have to write quite a bit of code to get that up and running.
It'd be a challenge for us to demo this effectively right now, but it's better just
because
that
we have really
talk about
high-end machines. So
yeah, it would go very, very quickly. But if you have a really long, really wide, I guess, grid that the user is panning very, very quickly on, those blocks, those individual items, they're passing by in milliseconds. And do they see black? Or do they see just a little bit? And then as they wait, do they see just a little bit more?
That's right.
And a little bit more?
Yep.
This is how you implement that. And actually, this is probably the best example of how a behavior, a good software architect could use a behavior to package up excellent code. Go to their best developer and say, hey, I need you to write the implementation for whatever, and I'm going to package that up as a behavior, and then I'll go to all of my devs, regardless of their level, and say, make sure you use this behavior because this is the right way to do it. It's already been implemented by Uni, and make sure, don't write your own. Here it is. It's all reusable and packaged up.
Yeah, and that way you have a single code base to maintain and not have to sort of hook it up to 10 different places.
Right, the framework gets revved and you're like, I could have done that even better if only this. No big deal, just change the behavior and everybody gets the benefit from it. Yeah, really nice, really, really nice. So that's the idea of a behavior, and then there's the action. And so here's an action. All we do is implement iAction. There's a lot of them that come right out of the box. Let's think about those for a second. There's the idea of, let's not talk about them. I'd rather actually just demonstrate this. So I have a project ready to go, and I'm going to pull that up. I'm going to take away this rectangle just because it will give me a twitch after a while if I keep looking at that. And let me see. We have a project here called, we're in module 3. Here's behaviors. Perfect. It's all set up for me and ready to go. I'll open up this the main view here in Blend, just like so. Could have done that in Blend as well. I don't know why I didn't. Right? It's just
I think Blend's waiting for you to respond to a prompt of saving or something like that.
All right, here we go. So this is the project. We have 8 of them that I want to show off really quickly, and I just want to kind of hit it right away. So this is a default project that I've added a simple view model with a couple of methods and properties so that I can make some changes. So let's start with the first one. I'll go into behaviors right here. It's the call method action. So it's weird to say behaviors and actions, but you can see here's the first behavior, the data trigger, here's the event trigger, and then here's that incremental. Those are the 3 that we have. Dragging in and using these actions implies a behavior, and we'll kind of get into that.
Absolutely. It's a shortcut for adding the behavior. Like you could choose to add the event trigger and then say, hey, I want to trigger the action on the click of a button, or you just drop the action and we do the right thing for you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's start with a button, actually. So here's a button that will add some sort of behavior on, and I'll also add a text block here, and I'll bind that to my view model. And so let's go in. You can see it just says text block right now. I already have everything set up, so all I need to do is set up the binding. And so I'll go into the properties of the text block right here, and I'll data bind that. And I'll say create data binding. It already knows the context of the view model. So this is going to be what are we doing here? This is an event. I'm going to hit a method. And so that is going to be the reload data is going to be the method. So there's a text that's associated to that to show me when the last time that it was reloaded. It'll sort of default as blank because nothing has happened yet. And in fact, let me make that just a little bit bigger so we can see the text. I'll make it, instead of 8, we'll make it, let's say 20, so that we can see it when it occurs. This is the button that will call the method. Now, if I were in Visual Studio, my only real option is to get a click event handler on this and then have that click event handler reach out and find that method and execute it. I could also, I suppose, line it up with a command that also calls the method, but that gets difficult. So it's a real easy way to do it. Here's the call method action. So I have 2 ways of doing it. I could drag the call method action directly onto the button or directly onto the button in the outline here. Or I could start by dragging the event trigger. So if I drag the event trigger first, I'll drag it onto the button, and you can see it's right here. And in the properties on the right, it's defaulted to be the click event of the button. But it doesn't have to be. It could be any of the events that could occur on that button, and it's reflection that looks at the button, sees all the publicly exposed events, and just goes with those. So now the behavior is only the first part of the 2-part piece here. This is the behavior that listens, so it'll fire when it clicks. And now I want to add one of the actions, so I'll use call method. I could drag it right to the behavior. Now I could call a method using that. Well, let me delete both of them just for a second. and show that I could also just drag call method directly to the button, and when I do, it adds the event for me. Defaults to click as the event, as that's the default event for any button, of course. Now, what method do I want to call? The first thing I do is set the context of what it's going to be. So I can click on this little box right here, which is available for things that we bind regularly. And so now here inside my view model, I'm going to bind this to something. No, I only bind it to the view model itself. That's just the context of where that method exists. But now what's the name of the method? Honestly, I can't remember. So I'm going to have to go to Visual Studio. I'll go into my, of course I could have done this in Blend, but I wrote this in Visual Studio. And I'll collapse this up. I can see I have a very simple view model here. It only has, right here it has this is a command, a relay command, as well as, or this is the relay command right here, and then this is a simple property that's related to that relay command. We'll come back to that in a second. This is what I care about right now. This reload method, and when it runs, all it does is update the load data text. And so here's the oh no, it's reload data text. Glad I looked at it. Reload data text. Here we go. So reload data text gets updated with the current date every time this method gets called. Pretty simple, but it might be something that you do want the user to do something slightly more complicated. So let me, I'll actually build that real quick. And so now I know it's the method name that I cared about, so I just copied that in my clipboard. Come over here and I can see the method. It's asking what the method name is here. I'm just going to paste that in so I get it right. And now there are two options for me. I could paste this into I could use a method that has no arguments like this one does. Or I could use it in a method that has two arguments, and both arguments are of type object. Then it's up to me to cast that. That means I could use an event that is, or I could use an event trigger that's like the click event or something like that. If the behavior then sees that this method has two arguments, it'll go ahead and pass those click event arguments in so I can use them. In this case, I'm not going to. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this so we can see it work. I have a single button. Instead of Control F5, I hit Control F4. That's pretty hilarious. So I'll go over to Projects, go down to,
Set the startup as well, right?
What's that? And I'll set the startup. That's exactly. Thank you. I'm so glad you're here. And the behave right here, this one right here, I'll right-click, say it's there. I'll open up the main view again so we can make another change in a second. So Control F5 so I can run and debug it. Just like in Visual Studio, packages up, deploys it, and runs it as well. And let me go back to Visual Studio. Let me just make sure nothing goofy is going on there. Yeah? Here we go. So let's try again. Control F5. There you go. Now it's forgiven me. So here's the button. As I click it, it executes the, oh boy. I know how to use it, yeah. As I click it, it executes the method, but I noticed that it didn't execute the method just then. And I have to think about it just for a second as for why. I gave it the context of the event,
The method name is not set? I don't think you pressed enter after setting the method name.
Ah, there we go, thanks. Let's try it again. Control F5 now, there you go. It probably was calling a blank method for me. So now when I click this button, the date is, oh, there's time, but at the time it's too far below. And so every time I click it, it's executing it again and updating it. And I didn't have to write any code with that. All I did was declare all the interactions with it. Let's do it again, but now let's do it with a different property, and we'll do this change property, which is potentially, or a different action, which is change property. So I'll say change property, but I'll do this on a button that I'm about to click. So I'll add a button. This one will change the property of a color property to red, and we'll have this one change it to green. And I'll have a rectangle that will bind to the actual property in the view model. So here's the rectangle. I'll go ahead and say I want to create a data binding and to this color property. So right now it's going to be bound to the default, which is nothing. Should have defaulted to something. That would have been nice. And now the first button, I'll add the change property. So here we go, right there. Change property to, there we are. Let's see, change property action. I'm suddenly panicked here. Can I pass in a string and it'll parse it correctly? Well, we're about to find out. Here's the change property action. I need to set its context. And by the way, when I set the context of what needs to be changed, one of the things I could change is the property of the rectangle completely. I don't have to do this through a view model. I could go into the property change and say, clicking this little target, and visually select what it is I want to change. So I could go right here, and now I'm going to change exactly this rectangle. And if I did, I could change its fill let's just say. And so it automatically reflects into the target and gets the correct kind. And so as I go down, I can see it has a fill instead of a background, so it already has that correct going into the rectangle. And I can say, what do I want to set that to? And I have this nice experience even here to pick whatever it is I want. So I could say, clicking this button will turn it to red. Clicking this button, on the other hand, I'll use the change property action again. And so here it is. Change property action will set, oh, that's the one for the other button. And I'll just scroll down a little so we can see it. Defaults to nothing. I can retarget it again to the rectangle. So it gets all of the correct properties. You can see fill right here. And I'll change it. Instead of being red, I can say it needs to be green. So now clicking on this will make it red. Clicking on this will make it green. In Visual Studio, my only option would be either a command or an event handler on this button to be able to change this directly. Now, if I say Control F5, I can go to either button and it will set the property using all of the behaviors and actions for me as well. Nice and powerful, and gives me a lot of options inside Blend to declare all of this without having to clutter up my code behind, as well as be able to use this reusable and encapsulated code as well. So I might have another action, or may have another state as well. Earlier, we talked about we might have different visual states. And so let's go to the States tab and just kind of do a very simple visual state. So I have two states. In the first state, let's say we have state 0 and 1, let's just say for now. So in state 0, and you can see it's outlined in red, which means all the property changes I make imply that that's the way the state's supposed to be. So when I'm in state 0, I'm not going to make any changes. I want it to be just like this. I want there to be a rectangle right here, and I want it to be white. But in state 2, I want it to be different. So now I've selected state 2. It's still recording, and or it's state 1. It's 0 and 1. I made them ordinal. Now I want to make a change so that this is actually over here, and I'll also make a color change so it's blue. So in state 1, or in state 0, in the first state, it's white, and in the second state, it is blue. And I can do a neat thing here where I can go ahead and give it a time period to play between those two. And I can say state 1 is white and to the left, and the next state is blue and to the right. Right there it is. But how would I make those changes? Well, in Visual Studio, really the only way is to use the Visual State Manager and code behind and to set it manually. But I could do the same thing with a button. And so let me go ahead and change this button that leverages the action. So I'll have a button here.
Don't do it in the state, otherwise it won't be visible.
Oh, I did it in the state. Oh, yeah, thanks. I'll go back up to base so it's not recording. Thanks for catching that. Boy, talk about something I do every time. It even circles it in red, and I still mistakenly do it. So I'll go back to assets where my behaviors are. And so here's the go to state action. I'm going to drag it right onto the button just like this. And when I do, I'll go down to the bottom here. Here it is. In the properties, you can see it's saying what state name do you want to change. And so I'll just drop this down. It sniffs out to know which ones are in scope for this button. And so 0 is where I'll begin. I'll do the exact same thing for the other button, just dragging it right onto it, going to its properties down here. And saying I want it to be in state 1. So now clicking on this should make it move to ordinal position 1, but state 0, and then this one would switch them off. So let's go ahead and try that. This is a neat way to change states without having to wire everything up, give everything a name, and like, all right, so the first one stays where it is. That's what we would expect. And the second one changes the state, and then the state itself, that mechanism, does all the transitions for me in that 1 second animation as well. So I can go back and forth between them. Nifty. That's probably a funny state to go between, but nonetheless it allows me to do it. If I happen to be using MVVM and using the relay command pattern, then I have a way of interacting with my view model without having a click handler. So, for example, if I have a button, and I'll add a button right here. This button, I could double click it and it would give me an event handler, but then I have a lot of code behind and I'm no longer abstracting my logic away from my view. So the way we do that is with the iCommand pattern. But how do I leverage that with behaviors? I do that with using the invoke command action, which is very valuable, right? I could wire these up on a button very easily because it has a command property already. But now I can have invoke command on an image that I click. I could have invoke command on a rectangle that I click, or mouse press, or anything that I want to be. I can use any behavior with this, and then it calls this action. So a simple enough one is just using the button.